Hi everyone, my name is Michael Howard. I'm the founder and CEO of MUSEA, and this is my IPS Mastermind class. We are talking about file prep for quality printing. We're going to do 4 videos. This one has 2 parts. First part is about file sizes in PPI. So we're going to start at the very beginning with your camera, and we're going to work from there and get into color spaces second. So let's begin. First off, let's just define what a pixel is, because your digital camera is a pixel. If you're a film shooter, when you get it scanned, it's getting digitized, so it is going to be in pixels. Your screens, computers, iPhones, everything's pixels. So what the heck is a pixel? We hear a lot about it. Well, a pixel is just the very basic foundation of what is in a digital display device. So it's just a picture element. Basically, it's a little square. If you ever zoomed in really close to a photo, you'll see it's just essentially just made of little bitty squares. That's a pixel, and they're typically just a color, a solid color. There's actually a thing called subpixels if you go even like farther in, and I think it's like red, blue, and green, deeper than that, but you really don't need to go that deep because it doesn't matter. So we're just talking about pixels. So let's talk about pixel size, the amount of pixels, and we're going to start with cameras. So let's talk about like a Canon Mark IV, 5D Mark IV. It's just one of the more popular cameras on the market right now, and it doesn't really matter what camera you have. It's just kind of understanding the resolution of your camera and what people talk about when they say megapixels, or like, my camera has got 60 megapixels. What the heck is that? All right, so what we're looking at with the Canon 5D Mark IV is a max resolution. I looked it up. It is 6,720 pixels on one side, and the other side it is 4,480 pixels. So this is the max amount of pixels, the max amount of resolution you can get out of that camera if you set it up correctly to give you the largest file possible, right? So you're not going to get any more pixels out of it. That's all the information that sensor is going to hold, okay? So let's do this. We're going to go into Photoshop. I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to create it at the same size of the 5D Mark IV resolution, okay? All right, so we're going to go pixels. So we're going to go 6,720, and the height we're going to go 4,480. We're going to set the resolution to 300. I'll talk about that in a second. All right, so here is the largest equivalent file size you're going to get out of a Canon 5D Mark IV camera. It'd be helpful if you just looked up your camera, whatever you're shooting with, look up its max resolution so you can kind of know, you can kind of do this exercise as well. And what you do is you just go to the image size menu in Photoshop. So you go at the top, image size, click on that. And what we're going to look for here, I'm going to drag this box in the middle, is what you're going to look for is the width and the height and the resolution, okay? So the dimensions, you have your 6,720 by 4,480, and then you have your width, height, resolution. The resample box needs to be unchecked for this because you do not want to rearrange the pixels. We just want to leave them as they are. So the default resolution, the pixels per inch PPI for print, what they say is 300. There's things you can learn about it where it's like the resolution isn't necessarily the case. It's really about the pixel count on the dimensions, the height and the width. But you can use the 300 number as in part of a math equation to get the correct pixel length. So it does factor in there, and it does play a role. But let's just look at this window for now. So what you're looking at 300 pixels per inch in your image size box for this file size we created, which is mimics the Canon 5D Mark IV max file, is you have width of 22.5 inches basically, and a height of pretty much 15 inches. So what that tells me as a photographer has to get like a pristine, great file without having to up-res this file. I can print it as large as a 15 by 22.5. Really odd size, but that's just where it is. So you could, crop it maybe to like a 16 by 20 because you're only going up an inch and you're coming down 2 inches on the width, that kind of thing. But that's your kind of max file size. So anything larger than that, a 15 by 22.5, you're going to need to up-res that file. And we will talk about up-resing and cropping in the later video, but just know that that's where the line is. And so you can look up your camera, you can figure out where that is for you, and where your line is for that. If you're going to go a smaller print, 8 by 10, no problem, because it's going to be less than your 15 inches by 22.5. So you're going to be cropping it down, or you could send the lab the full res file, and they can crop it for you. But just know that anything smaller than the 15 by 22.5, it's going to print great. It's going to print awesome. You don't even have to worry about any pixelization or anything like that. Most digital cameras on the market now today are around like 20 megapixels to 60 megapixels. The Canon 5D Mark IV that we're talking about now has 30.5 megapixels. So you can kind of see where that range is. So if you're carrying like a modern 2017, 2016 camera, you're probably going to be around that 15-inch, 22-inch range of like, that's your standard print size that your camera is just going to produce anytime you take a picture if you're at the max setting. So what the heck is a pixels per inch, PPI, and what's this other thing called DPI? So there are two of those. PPI stands for pixels per inch. DPI stands for dots per inch. DPI, or dots per inch, is really for the lab to worry about. It's talking about the printer and how many literally ink dots are going to be on the paper per inch. So it's kind of a printer resolution. So don't confuse it with your camera resolution. Those are two separate things. You will hear people mix them all the time between PPI and DPI, but just know technically there's a difference between PPI, pixels per inch, digital devices, your camera, dots per inch. DPI is for printers with inkjet going onto paper. So that's that clarification. All right, so let's just do a sample. We're going to do some math and talk about why that 300 pixels per inch number is a good number to know and use, okay? So I'm going to close this out, and we are going to look at this file that I've cropped and prepped for us. So we're going to go again to the image menu and then image size. And then in here, you will notice that, I'm going to make this a little bigger, the width and the height. So you got 8 inches width, 10 inches on the height, and then the resolution is 300. The important thing that would be really helpful for you to know is the dimensions that's at the top of that. Okay, so your dimensions field right up here above the original size is 2400 pixels by 3000 pixels. Now, you may have already figured it out, but if you haven't figured it out, you may be asking yourself, like, where is that 2400 pixels by 3000 pixels come from? It's just straight math, super simple. So all you're doing is you're taking the resolution of a file, 300, and you're going to multiply it by the width, 8. So that gets you 2400. 8 times 300 is 2400. So that's your 2400 pixels. Your 300 times 10 is 3000 pixels. And so that's how you know the pixel size for the files that you need. Okay, so it's good for you to know if you're going to order an 8x10 from a lab and you want to send them a cropped 8x10 at that exact size for them to print, so you're not sending the whole file over there, so you can maybe speed up your upload speeds or something, or you just want it cropped the way you want it, perfectly cropped and sized perfectly. At the end, you want to make sure it's 300 times your height and the width. Generally. Later, we're going to talk about up-resing, and there are times when your resolution can actually be lower, and the print quality will still be fine because you're printing larger. But on smaller stuff, you typically want a 300 ppi resolution and your height and width to get the dimensions you want. What labs are really concerned about, like really, we're not really concerned about your 300 ppi setting. We're really concerned about your dimensions, 2400 pixels by 3000 pixels. So that's how much information that we want to see to get you an 8x10. But to get those numbers, it's easiest if you just multiply your 8x300 and your 10x300. So when you're exporting from Lightroom or you're cropping in Photoshop, you know those are kind of the three numbers you need to be dealing with, and you need to be dealing with in your settings to produce an 8x10. Okay. If you keep this linked, for example, you can play with the size of the file. Okay, so we're going to kind of manipulate this real quick. So instead of doing 300 ppi, let's change it to 240, and we'll change this here, and you'll see automatically that our image got bigger. So now it is a 10-inch wide file by 12.5 inches tall. So all we did is you didn't change the dimensions of your file, so you still have your 2400 by 3000 pixels. But what you're doing is you're lowering the amount of pixels per inch. So what you're doing essentially is you're making them, when you print larger, you're making the pixels a little bit bigger. So if you have an inch long, literally you would have 300 squares in 1 inch if you're doing an 8x10 at 300 ppi. If you're going to be doing a print at 240 pixels per inch, you only literally have 240 squares in that inch. So that means it's spread out farther, and so the print becomes bigger. So what happens is if you make the prints, or make the pixels, spread them out too much, make them too big, then you start getting pixelization. For example, as a lab, if we see I'm going to change this back. If we see a file come in, and if we see a file come in, and they order an 8x10, and we do not see, well, what we're checking for is that, is it at least 2400 pixels by 3000 pixels in the dimensions? If it's smaller, let's say it's 1200 pixels by 1800 pixels, then we're concerned because there's not enough pixels, there's not enough information for us to print it without it possibly getting pixelated. Because what you're needing to do as a printer is, I'm going to have to take that 1200 pixels, I'm needing to double it to make it 2400, and then I need to take that 1800 pixels and I need to make it 3000 pixels, because for an 8x10 you need 2400 pixels by 3000 pixels without it, so it will not get pixelated. So we're always checking that. So if you're exporting or cropping and you're looking at specific print sizes, just do the math, and that's the basic way to do it. Is just to take your 300 ppi times the height times the width, and that will get you the dimensions that the lab would prefer to see. That way there's no fear of you sending a too small file. If you send us too large of a file, it's great, we can always work with that, but it just prevents you from sending too small of a file. So the main thing really for this section of the video is just kind of understanding that PPI, the input there, is just a way to adjust the physical size. So if you lower your pixels per inch, the print is going to get bigger. If you raise the pixels per inch, the file gets smaller. Okay, so I'm going to show you how it gets smaller. So if I drop this resolution, or if I increase it, let's say to 600, now my print says it's a 4-inch print by 5-inch print. So now there's 600 little squares every inch versus 300 squares every inch. The problem with that is, to the naked human eye, you can't really discern the differences between 300 pixels per inch and 600 pixels per inch. So the default is 300. You can also go down to 240 pixels per inch, and usually you'll be okay. If you start getting lower than that, you risk kind of pixelating things. In the PDF I gave you guys for this section, there are 3 links. It'd be great for you to reference. I think you'll really get a lot out of them. And they talk about resolution, understanding resolution, file size, the difference between PPI and DPI, and it digs in deeper to that. So we'll reference those, and we are going to move on to color spaces, Adobe RGB and sRGB. A huge step in producing quality prints is understanding your color space throughout the entire process and your game plan for how to deal with color spaces from beginning to the end. So the beginning is going to be your camera, middle is going to be your computer, the end is going to be the printer that the lab has. Okay, so you need to have a consistency or a game plan from your camera, computer, printer. So we're going to talk about that right now. All right, so what are the difference between Adobe RGB and sRGB? Adobe RGB is known as a larger color space. Okay, it has a 30% larger color space than sRGB. So you're probably thinking, well, if it's a larger color space, it's got more colors, I would rather use that for my photos than sRGB, which is a smaller color space. A lot of people just would think larger color space, Adobe RGB, better than sRGB. It's not necessarily the case. So in some situations it is, some situations it's not. Again, you got to have a game plan for how to deal with this. So what is sRGB and what is different about sRGB than Adobe RGB? sRGB is what the internet runs on. That's the color space of the internet. It's the color space of your phone. It's the color space of iPads. Pretty much everything, digital device is kind of built for an sRGB color space. It's kind of the default of the digital displays. If you're going to work in Adobe RGB, you can do that, but there's a couple things that have to happen. You really have to buy a specialized monitor for Adobe RGB. If you're just running an iMac, most photographers are on Macs. If you're running just kind of a generic Windows computer, if you're editing off a laptop or running off a laptop, you're pretty much running off sRGB color space on your monitor. So if your Photoshop is set to Adobe RGB, for example, your display is only showing you the sRGB color space, so you're editing blind probably 20 to 30% of the colors. You can't see them because your display is unable to present those to you because it's not made for it. So that is one big difference between Adobe RGB, sRGB. You can't just set, if you're setting your camera to Adobe RGB or something, you're not really going to see it necessarily on your computer screen if your computer screen only displays sRGB. Okay, so the one thing to consider is just, do you want to do an entire workflow that's just sRGB, because that's how a lot of things are kind of built. One of the benefits of doing an sRGB color space is it's the easiest way to have consistency in your files between what's on the internet and what you see in print, because the internet is sRGB, and if you prep for print in sRGB, it has a higher chance of matching what you see online. So meaning your website, clients come to your website, when they visit your website on their phone or on their computer, more than likely 95% of the time they're going to be looking at it in an sRGB display. So if you've uploaded Adobe RGB files to your website, what's going to happen is they're going to look at your website and the images are going to look kind of gray and kind of washed out and murky. So you don't really want that. So the easiest thing to do is work in sRGB, because the digital world runs off of that. Whether your really all about the greater color gamut or whatever, it doesn't necessarily translate online, because that's just not how the world works. That's not how it's set up. Eventually, maybe browser digital displays, iPhones and things will go to Adobe RGB, but for right now it's sRGB. So let's talk about your camera settings. So if you're going to shoot RAW on your camera, you don't need to set a color space, actually, because RAW is literally the raw information and there is no color space in it. The only time you really need to set a color space on your camera is if you're shooting RAW plus JPEG. I would advise against shooting JPEG only for a professional photographer, because you're microwaving your files down and it's just not gonna, you're risking not looking great if you didn't absolutely nail the exposure. RAW gives you a lot more latitude. So if you're shooting RAW only, don't even worry about the color space on your camera. It does not matter. If you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, then that's where the color space matters. And so you need to kind of figure out what philosophy you want to deal with. There's two philosophies when dealing with color space. One is this inverted pyramid philosophy. So some people, they say they want to work in the largest color spaces possible, and they will shrink it down as they get closer to getting ready to print, for example. So they shoot RAW, you have, that's just the raw information, and then when they're editing in Photoshop or Lightroom, they have a really nice expensive custom monitor that actually will display Adobe RGB correctly, and so they will edit in Adobe RGB, or they could even edit in ProPhoto RGB, which is an even larger color space. But I don't think as many monitors will show that color space. So Adobe RGB is kind of the default if you're going to do a nicer one. And then you would edit in Adobe RGB, and then you would export for print when you're done with everything, prepping the file in sRGB, if your printer only takes sRGB. Or if your printer takes Adobe RGB, you would just stay in Adobe RGB. But if you're going to upload to the web, you need to change it to sRGB for like your website, blog, post to Instagram, anything like that. You're going to need to create an sRGB file. So some photographers will start really wide Adobe RGB, and then they remember to save their files in the correct color space at the end, depending on the purpose of that file, whether it's digital going on the web or if their printer requires sRGB. So you have to remember to change your color space if you're going to do the inverted pyramid method. So the other philosophy is just keep it all the same. So you can just work in sRGB the entire time. So you can set your camera to sRGB, even though, again, like I said, if you're in RAW, you don't worry about it. But your Photoshop would be also set to sRGB, your working space. And then so when you're saving it, it just automatically saves it in sRGB, so it's always great. It's always ready to go for the web, and if your printer takes sRGB, then it's automatically ready to go for a printer, and so it's all good, and you don't have to really worry about your color spaces. You just set it up kind of one time, and then you're done. So what I'm going to show you, let's actually talk about Lightroom. Lightroom is a little different because you can't really set your color space in Lightroom that I've found. I've tried to find research on this. Lightroom is kind of defaulted to ProPhoto RGB, like this really wide color space, but most of us are on sRGB monitors, and so we don't even see all the colors that are potentially there. So when you're editing in Lightroom, you can't see everything, so you just have to go off what you're seeing, what your monitor sees. So if you do get a nicer monitor, then your Lightroom will display a larger color gamut than just like an iMac screen or a Mac laptop, or just a basic Windows monitor. So that is one thing to know. So if you do get like a just a higher expensive monitor, you're going to see more colors. And you can't really set that. So Lightroom is more about the settings you have when you export from Lightroom for your color space. Where Photoshop, you can actually set the working color space. So what I'm going to show you now is the setting your color space in Photoshop. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to go in Photoshop, you're going to go to Edit, and you go all the way down to your color settings. And here you can set your working color space. So Adobe RGB, you've got all of these color spaces, and you can set it to this SRGB and then all these numbers, -2.1. But you'll see here there's like a Pro Photo, and then there's Adobe. Those are the other two. But you can see here listed my monitor is sRGB. So I'm gonna work. I always keep my Photoshop in sRGB because that's this is what I'm doing the screen recording on is an sRGB monitor because it's a laptop, Mac laptop. And that's all you have to do is set for the color space, because you're as a photographer, you're probably really not going to be doing CMYK unless you're doing kind of press printing. But if you're doing more traditional photo printing or inkjet printing, you're going to be in the RGB color space. So I just set it to sRGB. So that's all you do. So you just go Edit, Color Settings, and then boom, your working color space. So done. All right, so if you're going to convert a file from Adobe RGB down to sRGB, let's say you are editing in Adobe RGB, but your lab accepts sRGB, then what you're going to do is you just go to the Edit menu in Photoshop, and you'll go all the way down to where it says Convert to Profile. So you just click that, and up here you'll have your profile where it says source space, and then what you want to do is convert it to whichever color space you want to. Usually at the top of the list here. So it's already in sRGB, but if I wanted to convert it to sRGB, say this was Adobe, that's how I would do it. And then you just click OK, and that's all you do. Then you just save it, and you can upload that to your lab because you're an sRGB. The main thing you need to do for printing, because this whole course is about prepping your file for printing, is you need to talk to your lab, because you need to know what color space they accept. So you need to know if they accept Adobe RGB, you need to know if they accept sRGB. At MUSEA, at our lab, we accept sRGB, and that's all we do. We don't even work in Adobe. So everything's just consistent for us with sRGB. So you just need to be aware of that. Also in the PDFs that is also with this course, there's more information. Color spaces is like kind of crazy because it's one of those things that if you really start reading a lot of web pages with it, you're gonna get into kind of some interesting discussions. It's almost kind of like a film versus digital feel, or a Canon versus Nikon type of discussion. So I kind of weeded out a lot of that stuff for you and just got to the super informative articles that I found online. So there's 3 of them. Those are in the PDF. Make sure to read those as well. They go even more in depth than what I did, and they'll help you understand. But the main thing here is just to know what philosophy you're doing. If you want to do inverted pyramid, start with a larger color space and then work your way down, depending on the purpose you're using, or just work in sRGB across the board. That way you have more confidence in that your color will be consistent with online viewing and in print form. All right, so that's it for this video 1. Next, we are going to be talking about color accuracy, so monitor calibration, ICC profiles. We're going to talk about editing environment, and we're also going to be talking about soft proofing in Photoshop and Lightroom. And if you can believe it, we're going to be talking about cropping as well. So the next video is going to be quite a bit, but we've got a ton of topics to talk about in this file prep stuff, and there's even more beyond that. We have 2 more videos beyond that. So thanks so much. Hope this was helpful, and I'll talk to you soon.